Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and welcome back to Black America Lineage. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for coming back to support this channel. Today, I want to talk about this man right here. This is Dred Scott, and this is one of the most heartbreaking stories from the slave era. This is a man who did everything right, who believed in the justice system, believed in the laws of the United States of America, and they failed him. He fought for his freedom through the courts, and he lost. This is Dred Scott, and this is his story. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who became the center of one of the most infamous Supreme Court cases in United States history, Dred Scott versus Sanford. In 1857, this is when the case was decided. He sued for his freedom, arguing that his time spent in free territories should have made him a free man. However, the Supreme Court ruled against him, stating that Africans, whether enslaved or free, could not be U.S. citizens and had no legal standing to sue in federal court. The decision also declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, further inflaming tensions between the South and North and pushing the country closer to the Civil War. Now, the problem here with Dred Scott is that Dred Scott was owned by a Dr. Emerson. They lived in the state of Missouri, which was a slave state. Missouri had entered the United States in 1819 as a slave state. The Louisiana Purchase had declared that lands that are north of the 36th, 30th parallel were to be free states. And then the Missouri Compromise, which was federal legislation of the United States, balanced the desires of the northern state, which was to prevent slavery from expanding further into the United States, against the southern state legislators who wanted to expand it. The southern legislators wanted slavery to exist in all of the states, and that doesn't surprise us at all. But the Missouri Compromise said that if you are an enslaved person and you leave a slave state and go into one of those states where slavery has been banned, you can declare your freedom. So Dr. Emerson moved his family from Missouri, which was a slave state, to the Wisconsin territory, which was free, and then into the Minnesota territory, which was free. And then he moved his family back to St. Louis, Missouri. Now, what that means was that he had moved Dred Scott out of a slave state into two free states. The law said that if you move an enslaved person into a free state, that enslaved person can petition the United States government for their freedom. That was what the Missouri Compromise said. While he was in the Minnesota Territory, Dred Scott met Harriet Robinson, who had been enslaved in Virginia, but her slave master also moved her to Minnesota. So they got married, and she became a part of the Emerson household. Dr. Emerson moved his family back to Missouri. Now, Harriet Scott, Dred Scott's wife, petitioned the court for her freedom. She was granted her freedom, but she was married to Dred Scott, so she went back into Missouri with Dred Scott. Shortly after they moved back to St. Louis, Dr. Emerson died. Dred Scott petitioned the court for his freedom, and he was denied that freedom. So then he decided to take his case to the Supreme Court. Now he petitioned in 1846. They held his case out until 1857, which is just unconscionable. But what happened was Dr. Emerson's wife decided that she wasn't going to free Harriet Scott or Dred Scott, and she combined Harriet Scott and Dred Scott's case together. So Harriet is no longer free, but now she was a part of the Dred Scott case, which was called Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott and Harriet also had two daughters, and they were thrown in the case too. So it was the entire Scott family versus this uh, Sanford. Dred Scott versus Sanford, decided by the United States Supreme Court on March 6, 1857, declared that black people, whether free or enslaved, could not be American citizens and were thus constitutionally unable to sue for citizenship in the federal courts. The court's majority opinion also declared that the 1820 Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that the United States Congress could not prohibit enslavement in the U.S. territories that had not attained statehood. So Dred Scott's decision basically turned back the rights that had been given the enslaved people in the Missouri Compromise, which said that if you move from a slave state to a free state, you are free. And once free, always free. But this activist Supreme Court came back and said the Missouri Compromise had no business doing that. You are enslaved and you have no right to sue for your freedom in federal court. And that was the disservice and the unfairness that was done to the Dred Scott and his family. Now, because the Supreme Court robbed the enslaved people of a right that they had given them when slavery ended a few years later with the 13th Amendment, the Congress understood that they needed to make the enslaved people citizens. And that is when we got the 14th Amendment because they had done so shabbily towards Dred Scott. They knew that going forward, the formerly enslaved people and their descendants needed to be constitutionally declared citizens of the United States. And that is the 14th Amendment that everybody is riding on because they were born in the United States, because that's what the 14th Amendment said. If you were born in the United States, you are an American citizen. But that law was made for the enslaved people, not people coming into this country illegally. All these many years later, we can't even imagine how devastating and heartbreaking it was for this family. They had been enslaved. They had done their due diligence as slaves, but they had been moved to free states. So the law had said you can petition the court for your freedom if you lived in a free state. And they reneged on them. And not only that, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court went as far as to say a slave doesn't have any rights that a white man has to respect. This is the kind of people that we've been dealing with from the very beginning. And that spirit is still here in this country. It really is. This is a plaque at the courthouse in St. Louis where Dred Scott and Harriet Scott filed suit for their freedom. And it reads, Dred and Harriet Scott filed suit for their freedom at this courthouse in 1846. Their case reached the United States Supreme Court and was decided in 1857. The court ruled that the Scots and all Africans were not citizens of the United States. Opposition to the decision was one of the causes of the Civil War and led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The Scots' struggle for freedom stands as a defining moment in the history of the civil rights movement. Now, the good thing that came out of the Dred Scott decision was that the Congress of the United States realized that we needed to be in the Constitution because otherwise something else would come up and then we would have another big fight on our hands. So we can thank Dred Scott, even though we can also mourn the humiliation and the devastation that his family had to face. Following the Supreme Court's decision, a Republican congressman named Taylor Blow manumitted. I don't know why they call him manumitted. I don't know why they don't just say he bought the freedom of Dred Scott and his family. So Dred Scott was able to live in freedom the short time that he lived. After he was bought and freed by this man named Taylor Blow, he worked as a porter in a St. Louis hotel. But his freedom was short lived. He died from tuberculosis in September of 1858. He was survived by his wife and two daughters. Now, fortunately, Harriet Scott and the daughters lived long enough for the Civil War to come and the Union Army win. And so they were freed and truly freed and made citizens of the United States. On June 8th of 2012, the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, the National Park Service, and master sculptor Harry Weber were incredibly proud to unveil a statue of Dred and Harriet Scott on the south lawn of the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis. The Scotts are depicted standing close, holding their heads high, their eyes directed not only outward and across the Mississippi River, but toward a horizon of freedom in which they believed enough to one day finally see. We are incredibly proud of these brave and courageous ancestors. They stood up to the American system, dared them to live up to their ideals, and they did not. And yet they persevered. So continue your peaceful rest, Dred and Harriet Scott. Thank you for listening. Have a good evening.